Have you ever thought about what really limits a country's freedom? Sometimes the threat doesn't come from an enemy at the border, but from the very partner it trusts the most. When a nation's military gear, trade deals, and economic stability all hinge on the approval of a superpower, can it truly call itself independent? That question is no longer theoretical. A major rift has emerged in North America, one that could shift the balance of influence across the Western world. For years, Canada leaned on its southern neighbor for defense and commerce, following a quiet understanding. American equipment and policies were the only practical choice. It was convenient, uncontroversial, and safe. But all of that changed in Munich, in a tense exchange that left seasoned diplomats speechless and shook what many assumed was an unshakable alliance. This is the story of how Ottawa and Washington came to a standoff and what it means for the future of their relationship. The breaking point didn't happen in secret meetings or classified rooms. It happened in public, under bright lights, at the Munich Security Conference in February 2025. For years, pressure between allies had been handled quietly through private talks and polite warnings. That day, the tone changed completely. The U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, dropped all pretense. People in the room later described the atmosphere as heavy and tense. Speaking directly to the cameras, the ambassador addressed Canada not as a partner, but as someone being warned. His message was blunt: buy the American fighter jet or lose access to U.S. trade. There was no ambiguity. It was a threat. This wasn't a case for why the F-35 was the best aircraft. It wasn't about shared systems or NATO compatibility. It directly tied Canada's military purchase to its economic survival. Hoekstra openly stated that Canada's trade relationship with the United States, one that supports millions of jobs and moves hundreds of billions of dollars each year, would be reconsidered if the F-35 deal fell apart. In diplomatic language, reconsidered often means dismantled. The silence that followed made it clear everyone understood what was being said. This was no longer about shared defense. It was a loyalty check. The message was clear. Allies were expected to comply, not choose. That moment exposed how American power really operates. The ambassador wasn't freelancing. He was stating policy. The goal was obedience, not agreement. By tying trade to a defense contract, Washington treated Canada not like a fellow G7 nation, but like a dependent client. It was meant to embarrass Canada publicly and warn other allies watching: step out of line and face economic punishment. What U.S. officials didn't expect was how that humiliation would backfire. Instead of forcing Ottawa to fold, the threat cracked open a question Canada had avoided for decades. If independence can be taken away whenever Washington finds it inconvenient, how real was that independence to begin with? At the center of this conflict is a hard choice. One path leads to long-term dependence. The other points toward control over Canada's own future. To understand why Canada hesitated on the F-35, you have to look beyond marketing claims and examine how the system actually works. The F-35 Lightning II is often promoted as the most advanced fighter jet ever built, but for Canada, it comes with serious risks. The aircraft isn't just a jet. It's part of a massive system worth more than $1.7 trillion, designed to keep buyer nations locked in for decades. Buying the F-35 means buying into a setup where control stays in American hands. The software that runs the aircraft, the core of the system, remains fully controlled by the United States. Canada would not be able to update, modify, or fully service its own jets without U.S. approval and U.S. contractors. That creates a major problem. Running an air force on software you can't access or manage puts national defense on a lease, not ownership. If political relations worsen, updates and spare parts can be delayed or denied. Recent tensions show that this isn't a theoretical concern. It also builds long-term weakness into the defense system itself. On top of that, the F-35 doesn't fit Canada's geography very well. Canada is the second largest country in the world, with a massive Arctic region that requires long-distance patrols and tough operating conditions. The F-35 was designed for shorter missions and depends heavily on climate-controlled hangars and extensive maintenance. Military critics and retired Canadian officers have warned for years that the jet lacks the range needed for Arctic patrols unless it relies heavily on aerial refueling, which creates yet another layer of dependence. Then there's the money. Industry Minister Melanie Joly caused shockwaves when she publicly stated that Canada wasn't getting enough in return from the F-35 program. The industrial benefits promised by the US-led group never fully arrived. Billions in Canadian tax dollars went south, while Canadian companies received only limited contracts. That's when Saab entered the picture. The Swedish company didn't just present an aircraft, they offered a different approach. The Gripen E wasn't pitched as just another jet, but as a tool for national control. Sweden's defense minister made it clear, if Canada bought the Gripen, it would fully belong to Canada. Saab offered full technology transfer. They proposed building the jets inside Canada, with Canadian workers using Canadian materials. They also offered complete access to the software. That meant Canada could update systems, integrate new weapons, and make changes without needing permission from Stockholm. It was a partnership based on equality, not hierarchy. The economic impact of Saab's proposal was significant. The company committed to creating up to 10,000 skilled jobs, with production centers planned for Nova Scotia and Montreal. Their vision was a future where Canadian engineers weren't just assembling parts, but running and shaping their own aerospace industry. For engineers in Montreal and factory workers in Hamilton, this deal meant far more than paperwork. It felt like a revival of Canada's industrial confidence. The Gripen was also built with northern conditions in mind. Designed in Sweden, it was meant to operate from frozen highways and spread out bases. These are conditions where it performs well, especially compared to the F-35. The aircraft is tough, simple to service, and far cheaper to run. It stood for durability and for a defense force that could function on its own without being tied to political instability in Washington. This decision was never just about aircraft. It was about choosing between two long-term directions. One direction tied Canada to decades of reliance, leasing capability from an unpredictable neighbor. The other opened the door to national control, domestic industry growth, and the pride that comes with standing on your own. Once it became clear that Canada was seriously weighing the Swedish option, the response from Washington shifted fast. Instead of offering better terms, the pressure increased. What followed under the Trump administration was a coordinated campaign aimed at making refusal too costly. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra became the public face of that pressure. His tone dropped any hint of partnership. He spoke plainly and aggressively, making it clear that buying the F-35 was seen as the price Canada had to pay to keep its economy running smoothly. But he was only the spokesperson for a broader plan coming straight from the White House. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like the video and consider subscribing. Your support allows us to keep bringing detailed global coverage. Now, back to the topic. President Trump, newly confident in his second term, pushed the rhetoric even further. In a moment that quickly spread across global media, he referred to Canada as the 51st state. It was a direct insult and a dismissal of Canada's status as an independent nation. Soon after, he refused to meet Prime Minister Mark Carney at the APEC summit. The move was meant to sideline Canada's leader on the international stage. Then the pressure moved from words to economics. The United States imposed tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and lumber. This was followed by counter tariffs of up to 25% on cars and auto parts, aimed squarely at Ontario's manufacturing base. The message could not have been clearer. Washington was willing to damage the integrated North American auto industry to force Ottawa to comply. Trade talks stalled. Each time Canadian officials tried to reach an agreement, the terms shifted. The goal was never compromise, it was submission. The U.S. wanted Canada to accept that its economy functioned only with American approval. But this strategy rested on a bad assumption. It assumed Canada had no alternatives. It assumed economic pressure would outweigh national pride. That misread the situation and triggered the opposite result, a shift away from dependence. Facing this hostility, Canada had to act. What followed was a major change in direction. For a short time, Ottawa went quiet. Some took the silence as hesitation, but it was careful planning. Prime Minister Mark Carney and his cabinet understood that waiting for Washington to change course was no longer an option. The United States had changed, possibly for good, and Canada had to adjust. When the response came, it wasn't a step back. It was a break outward. Canada launched a broad push to reduce reliance on a single market, building trade barriers that could withstand future pressure. The most important moves took place across the Pacific. In Gyeongju, South Korea, Prime Minister Carney met with President Lee Jae-young. Away from Washington's spotlight, they signed a major defense and security cooperation agreement. This marked a turning point. For the first time, Canada was anchoring its defense planning beyond North America and into the Indo-Pacific. The agreement had real substance. It included joint work on advanced submarines and shipbuilding, drawing on South Korea's large industrial base. It also set up systems for sharing sensitive information and protecting supplies of key minerals. The message was clear. Canada was looking for partners who respected its need to act independently. And Carney didn't stop there. In a move that surprised many observers, he opened talks with China. While President Trump refused to meet with him, Carney arranged discussions with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The contrast was hard to miss. Washington's top foreign policy goal was to limit China's reach. Yet by applying pressure to its closest ally, it pushed Canada toward talks with Beijing. For Canada, this was a practical step. If access to the U.S. market was going to be restricted, Canadian exports like canola, energy, and manufactured goods had to find new buyers. The meeting with Xi sent a clear signal. Canada would do business with countries that treated it as an equal. It rejected the idea that loyalty to Washington should come without respect in return. At the same time, Ottawa strengthened ties to Mexico. Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum agreed on a new partnership focused on biofuels, farming, and infrastructure. Both countries recognized the same challenge. Living next to an unpredictable superpower meant they needed stronger direct links with each other. Across the Atlantic, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne was sent to Europe with a clear task. He worked to expand the existing trade agreement into what was described as CETA+. The goal was deeper cooperation in areas like artificial intelligence, defense manufacturing, and critical minerals. Canada was telling the European Union that it could be a reliable supplier as Europe reduced its reliance on Russian energy and Chinese resources. This wide-ranging diplomatic push changed how Canada was seen. It showed the country was not a passive extension of another economy. It was a G7 nation with resources, skilled labor, and the ability to build new partnerships. The attempt to box Canada in had the opposite effect. It pushed Ottawa toward acting like an independent middle power. While these disputes played out in public, something quieter was happening in the mining sector. As headlines focused on jets and tariffs, another example of the limits of U.S. pressure emerged. The United States, eager to secure materials needed for batteries, chips, and modern defense systems, began investing directly in Canadian mining firms. Washington bought a 10% stake in Trilogy Metals and a 5% stake in Lithium Americas, directing large sums into companies based in British Columbia. From the Trump administration's point of view, this fit neatly with its America First thinking. But it created an odd situation. By buying into Canadian companies, the U.S. tied its own security needs to Canada's stability. It was investing in the same economy it was trying to squeeze through tariffs, and ownership only went so far. While American firms could hold shares, the land itself remained Canadian, the permits were Canadian, and the processing facilities mattered most of all. Raw minerals mean nothing without refining. The facilities that process zinc, germanium, and lithium fall under Canadian rules and Canadian control. This put Ottawa in a strong position. If Washington pushed too aggressively on trade disputes or the F-35 issue, it risked interrupting the supply of minerals it depends on to build weapon systems and electric vehicles. Canada had leverage. The U.S. defense sector relies heavily on Canadian resources, and that reality mattered more than political noise. No matter the tough talk, Washington depended on Canada far more than it was willing to say out loud. The idea of Canada as a 51st state quickly fell apart when faced with a simple truth. The American defense industry cannot operate properly without Canadian cooperation. This push for independence becomes even clearer in the one region that defines Canada more than any other, the Arctic. Trade routes and mineral supply chains may feel distant to most people, but the northern map is not. The Arctic is physical, visible, and deeply tied to national identity. Ottawa carries a real sense of unease about the North. That concern has grown as Canadian leaders have come to terms with an uncomfortable reality. The country's closest ally could also become its most serious territorial rival. Control of the Arctic is no longer a distant issue for future decades. It is happening now, and it plays a major role in Canada's move away from U.S. military dominance. For decades, Canada has argued that the Northwest Passage is an internal waterway under Canadian control, governed by its own laws and environmental rules. The United States has never accepted that claim. Instead, it treats the passage as an international route that any nation can use. For years, this disagreement stayed manageable. It was a quiet dispute between allies. But as ice continues to melt and the passage becomes more accessible to global shipping, the situation has changed. When President Trump openly talked about buying Greenland and later suggested annexing Canada, those comments were more than careless remarks. They reflected a view of the Arctic as territory to be acquired rather than respected. This brings the fighter jet question into sharp focus. If Canada selects the F-35, it chooses an aircraft with serious limits in the high north unless heavy support is provided. The F-35's limited range makes it poorly suited for patrolling the massive Arctic region from existing Canadian bases without mid-air refueling, and those refueling aircraft belong to the United States Air Force. That reality carries major consequences. If Canada needs to respond in the Arctic, whether to intercept a Russian aircraft or, more awkwardly, to track an unauthorized American ship, it would need fuel supplied by the U.S. In effect, Canada would need approval from another country to operate over its own territory. That is not true sovereignty. It is dependence under supervision. It weakens Canada's claim over the Northwest Passage because a nation that cannot patrol its own airspace without outside help does not fully control it. The Gripen changes this situation entirely. The Swedish aircraft was built with northern conditions in mind. It was designed to operate from scattered locations in cold environments. It can land on frozen roads, refuel from basic ground vehicles, and take off again quickly. It does not rely on specialized hangars or American refueling planes. This gives the Royal Canadian Air Force the ability to operate independently and maintain a constant presence in the Arctic on its own terms. That is why Canada's cooperation with Sweden is about far more than a plane purchase. The discussions between Prime Minister Carney and Swedish officials covered northern defense issues that went well beyond aviation. Sweden and Canada share similar concerns. Both are northern nations facing pressure from Russia to the east and uncertainty from the United States to the south and west. Together, they are working toward a northern partnership among mid-sized powers, countries that understand that if they fail to protect the Arctic themselves, larger powers will divide it between them. The risks in the north are real. Russia and China are expanding their icebreaker fleets and increasing their presence in the region. But the uncomfortable reality, quietly acknowledged in Ottawa, is that the concern does not come only from overseas. It also comes from the South. When Washington speaks about North American security, it often frames it as American security extending northward, with Canada serving mainly as the land in between. By choosing a defense strategy that does not depend on the United States, Canada is setting a clear boundary. It is stating that the Arctic is not an American buffer zone, it is Canadian territory. And defending that claim requires military tools controlled by Ottawa alone. This shift has gone beyond government policy. It has triggered a strong public response and stirred a sense of national awareness. While strategies are discussed in offices and meeting rooms, real independence depends on public support. The confrontational tone coming from Washington sparked a cultural change that no political campaign could have created. The 51st state remark acted as a turning point. It pushed many Canadians to rethink their relationship with the United States. For decades, American culture and products were deeply woven into Canadian daily life. But the dismissive attitude shown during the Trump years changed that dynamic. A consumer-led boycott began to grow, not directed by officials, but driven by public frustration. Polls showed that 71% of Canadians planned to cut back on American purchases. This was not symbolic. Grocery stores saw U.S. produce sitting untouched, while shoppers chose Canadian or non-American options. Liquor stores reported sharp drops in sales of American bourbon and California wines, replaced by bottles from Europe, Australia, and elsewhere. The shift extended beyond shopping. Canadian travel to the United States, which had pumped billions into the U.S. economy each year, dropped sharply. Online searches for U.S. vacations fell by half. Border towns that had long relied on Canadian visitors saw empty parking lots and closed storefronts. This reaction went beyond economics. It marked a mental break. Canadians began defining themselves less by closeness to the United States and more by their independence from it. The boycott showed that economic integration, once thought permanent, could be reversed when the cost became disrespect. If you found this breakdown of the changing North American balance useful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue covering major geopolitical shifts in depth. What we are seeing now is a clear turning point. Automatic alignment is ending and a new phase is beginning. The debate between the F-35 and the Gripen is not really about speed or stealth. It is about how quickly a country claims control over its future and how firmly it protects its independence. What was meant to pressure Canada into compliance instead had the opposite effect. It broke a long-standing habit of silent acceptance and reminded Canadians that independence is not something handed down by history. It has to be protected continuously. It also made one thing clear: a relationship built on threats is not a partnership. It is a ranking system, and those systems fail when the weaker party refuses to submit. Canada is taking the more difficult route. Choosing diversification and independence carries risk. It demands spending, resolve, and the ability to absorb economic setbacks. But the alternative, full reliance on the F-35 and continued dependence, leads to long-term weakness. By working with Sweden, South Korea, Europe, and by developing its own capabilities, Canada is reshaping its role on the continent. It is no longer content to stand beside power. It is choosing to act as a power itself. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think about this standoff, and make sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story.